Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. If you have a small farm like we do, chances are you're looking for an old tractor to help you out on the farm. We just don't have the capital to afford a brand new shiny tractor, so small farmers go looking for old used tractors. In this video, I'm going to give you kind of a farm tractor 101. What to look for in an old tractor, what you can do with an old tractor, what you can't do with an old tractor, all the basics. First, let's go through the very basic components of any tractor. I'm going to use our Farm All H here as an example. It was built in 1940. It's a really simple tractor and everything's relatively easy to see. So good example. You've got the engine generating power. Radiator is out in front of the engine in here. Right behind the engine you have the clutch, and all the clutch is a friction mechanism. It's got discs that press against each other, and the friction of those discs drives the power back to the transmission in the tractor. So the clutch is in here. Behind the clutch there's a shaft that comes into the transmission here. This tractor has a hydraulic pump that's under here. It's called a belly pump when it's located here. The hydraulic pump can be in different locations based on your tractor. It can be under here, it can be inside the housing, it can be up front, and I'll get to the types a little later on. So hydraulic pump, shaft from the clutch coming back to the transmission. Now in this whole big housing in the back, the transmission only occupies this little part of it, and all the transmission is a set of sliding gears, and you use the gear shift lever to select which gears mesh to make the tractor go in reverse or forward. This tractor has 5 gears forward. Gears can vary. Behind the transmission, in the big case, is the final drive, a set of big gears that transmit power from the transmission to the wheel axles and down to the wheels. And those are all the basic parts of a simple tractor. Older tractors like this H, say prior to 1950 or so, have some limitations for a small farm, and that's because tractors of this area were primarily designed to do one thing, and that is pull. They have what's called a fixed drawbar, and 90% of what this tractor did back in the day was pull stuff, pulled the plow, pulled wagons, etc. The major limitations of this older tractor are in the PTO, which is this round shaft here used to power trailing implements, and hydraulics. They just aren't up to snuff for modern applications, and one of the main reasons they're not up to snuff is neither of them are what's called live, which means whenever you push in the clutch, everything stops. The tractor stops, the PTO stops, the hydraulics won't work, and that's because all of that stuff is driven off of the transmission, so when the transmission stops, nothing works. At around 1950, and this is going to vary by tractor manufacturer, but manufacturers started to focus more on hydraulics and PTO for ever more demanding applications, as well as increasing horsepower. So this is a 1964 Farm All 504. The H is a 1940. There was a lot of progress between the two, and this tractor has live PTO and hydraulics. The PTO and the hydraulics both work directly off the engine, independent of the clutch, so they're all working when the clutch is pressed in. The other big change that happened is the hydraulics became ever more complicated. So this tractor has power steering, which the H doesn't have. It has a lot of different valves and dividers to send hydraulic fluid to the right areas, power steering, transmission, and hydraulic systems. It has multiple valves. The valves work both up and down, so when I was looking at the H hydraulics, the hydraulics on the H only have power one way. They raise the cylinder. When you let that cylinder back down, it just drains the oil through the same hydraulic line, and there's no power. It's just gravity that's letting things down. On this tractor, you have both up and down force on the hydraulics. The other big change that happened around 1950 and later, sometimes earlier on other models, is the hitch changed. So this tractor has a 3-point hitch, which is awful handy for a lot of different implements. It raises and lowers. It's got what's called draft control. So by working the levers over there on what's called the quadrant on the right-hand side of the seat, you can actually change how much downforce is applied to whatever you're using in the back, and it was most appropriate for plowing. So you could adjust the draft to either push down real hard and not let up, say if the plow hit a rock, or you could adjust it to be a little lighter so that the hitch would adjust automatically up and down as you hit easy and tough spots in the ground you were working. This tractor is like the space shuttle compared to the H, and there's just so much more handiness to it. As you see, this tractor's got a loader on the front. It has multiple hydraulic valves. Now, I like to think of hydraulics like an electrical circuit. So you have power coming into that circuit, and the workhorse of the circuit, of course, is the hydraulic cylinder here. And this loader has 4 of them on it in 2 circuits. You've got one set of cylinders that raise and lower the loader, and then you've got a second set of cylinders here that tilt whatever you have attached. Something you can have on your loader that makes it even handier is a quick attach system. And all a quick attach system is a quick means to detach and attach implements or buckets or bale spears or whatever on the front of your loader very easily. And these are universal. This is a skid steer quick attach universal. John Deere has their own proprietary quick attach system, but most of the other manufacturers use this system, and it's easy to find attachments for it. It's easy to retrofit these loaders with these, and to detach it, all you do is you pull up on these 2 levers on either side, raise the loader, and you can take the bucket off, and then you can drive up to whatever you want to use next and do it in reverse and just push these levers back down. There we go, and away you go. It's a lot easier than the old method of changing things, which was to take out 4 pins here and then try and line everything up before you could get it hooked up. The number one question I get from people that are just starting in farms and are relative newbies to old tractors is, what size and what brand do I need? It's a big market out there. We're talking about probably 70 or 80 years worth of model tractors, and it can be overwhelming. The first thing you need to do before you go out looking for a tractor is figure out what you want to do with it. You know, do you want it just to pull wagons? Do you want to bale hay? Do you want to do loader work? And then that's going to narrow that size of or amount or quantity of tractors down quite a bit. So let's go through the different things you might want to do and what's required for that. First is pulling wagons. Older tractors are great at pulling wagons, and the older you get, usually the cheaper you get with tractors. So both this Super C that I'm sitting in front of and the H that I showed you a few minutes ago are great for pulling stuff around. They'll pull hay wagons, they'll pull trailers, firewood, you name it, they're great at pulling. They're both in the 20 horsepower range, which is kind of a base range for a small farm tractor. As you move up the line, you start to talk about tillage. You know, will it pull a plow? Will it pull a cultivator? These tractors are also good for that. And if you're pulling a plow, the usual rule of thumb for old tractors is 10 horsepower per bottom. So this tractor and the H are both around 20 horsepower. They'll pull a 2-bottom plow. And now that depends on your soil, obviously, but that's what you're looking at. And if you move up to a 30 horsepower, 40 horsepower, you can just add a plow bottom for each 10 horsepower, in general for old tractors. Up from that, you come into baling, baling hay is another almost essential aspect of having a small livestock farm. And there's 2 categories. First, the old square balers. We used to run an old square baler off of our H. It worked just fine. Not having a live PTO makes it a bit more of a challenge, but it'll work. And once you get used to it, it works just fine. Small square balers of the older varieties, say the old New Hollands from the 60s and the 50s, they require about 20, 25, 30 horsepower to pull all right. We pulled the baler around with our H, and it did just fine. If you're getting into pulling a square baler with a kicker or a thrower on the back and a wagon behind that, you're probably starting to look at something a little bigger in the 40 to 50 horsepower range. 30 horsepower range would probably work. If you get into round baling, the horsepower increases more. So we run an old round baler on our 656, which is the big one behind me. That's a 65 horsepower tractor. It runs a round baler great. You can't run a round baler for what you would a square baler. You're looking at 50 plus horsepower for a round baler, and terrain comes into play too. If you're just farming on flat land, you need less horsepower than you would if you're working on steep, hilly terrain. So the size depends on what you're going to do with it. Also, the sort of how modern the tractor is, it has a great influence in what you're going to do with it. If you want to do a whole lot of loader work, working with tractors of, say, this vintage or the H's vintage, it doesn't work very well. It can be done, and there were loaders attached to these tractors and still are around, but you really should be looking for something subsequent to 1950 that has a better hydraulic system, that has better hydraulic pressure, more remotes to work a loader. You'll just be happier in the end with that. Now, what about brand? As you see, we have all red tractors. We've got a ton of them. I'm partial to red tractors because I grew up on them, and you may be partial to one brand or another too, because that's what you had experience with, and that's fine. There are many, many old brands of tractors to choose from, and I actually have a list here because I can't remember them all off the top of my head. International, like we drive, John Deere, Oliver, Massey Harris, or Massey Ferguson, depending on the vintage. They teamed up with Ferguson for a while. Ford, which Ferguson also teamed up with for a while. Case, Allis Chalmers, Minneapolis Moline. Those are the dominant brands in the U.S. as you go through the mid-1950s. Now, of course, you only have John Deere being made in the U.S., but that doesn't limit what you buy to John Deere as far as parts. There's a good aftermarket parts resource for almost all of these brands around, so don't limit yourself. And you'll find, based on what area of the country you live in, there may be brands that are more dominant than others, because in the old days it was based on dealership service. Farmers would often buy what they could most easily get parts for, and it's kind of the same today. One of the reasons we run red tractors is because there's still Case IH dealers around and we can get parts for them. All right, what about gas versus diesel? Because almost all modern tractors are diesel engines and very efficient and long lasting. Unfortunately, diesel engines were kind of tough to work with until probably the 60s. All of the tractors that you see around me are gas engines, and they're reliable. They start well in cold weather. They run fairly efficiently. This H will run all day doing a decent amount of hard work on 10 gallons, which I consider a fuel efficient tractor. Earlier diesels, like this 656, this 656 was made in 1973, but it has a lot of older technology in it. This is a diesel tractor. Diesels of this era, which the engine from this was designed in the 1950s, are a little bit harder to work with than the gas engines of that same era, because you have systems to start it when it's cold. You've got a glow plug system. They don't start as easily when they're cold. They're just a lot more finicky to work on and maintain than the simple old gas engines. So if you're looking for an old tractor as a small farm owner, I would really recommend going with gas. This has been a really basic introduction to how to choose an old tractor for your small farm. I value your feedback. What do you want to know? I can delve into all kinds of detail about the individual systems on tractors, the ins and outs of what you want to use it for. Please let me know down in the comments section, and I'll do future videos on those subjects. Thank you, and have a great day.